All right, let's go ahead and give question 3 from the final exam in 2016 a shot. As for the other questions, we're going to be walking through this as if I'm taking the exam rather than giving you the full-blown long explanations of everything. That's what we have the written out solutions for. But I want you to think about what you need to do on an exam, what you need to say on an exam. So let's give it a shot here with question 3. So here we go. So there are 4 bookstores in the city currently selling a combined total of 200 books. So I'm going to keep track of that up at the top here. So I've got 4 stores, right? And current quantity of books is going to be 200. So that's whatever my initial equilibrium here is, right? Okay, so now we have Ansel here deciding to open a new bookstore. He decided how many to order. So the market price of books depends on the total number of books sold by all 5 bookstores, right? So we're adding 1 new bookstore up here. So I'm just trying to keep track of these details. Okay, so that demand curve is clearly going to be important. So here we're using B to talk about the total number of books. So I'm going to keep track of that. So Ansel has $500 in fixed costs. So let's go ahead and pull that info out so we don't have to find it in the text anymore. So fixed costs equal to 500. Each additional book he orders costs him $5. He has no other variable costs. So if 1 more book raises my cost by 5 every time, that tells me my marginal costs are equal to 5. And that also tells me that my average variable costs are equal to 5. So just keeping track of everything here so I've got it on hand, easy to work with. All right, part A here. Write down a function, CBA, giving Ansel's total costs if he chooses to order BA books. So I'm going to start by just writing down what it tells me to write down here. I'm trying to find the CBA equal to something. So it's going to be costs as a function of the number of books BA. All right, so I was already told up here that I have fixed costs of 500. So if I'm thinking in terms of fixed costs and variable costs, well then it makes sense to sort of set those up separately here. All right? I already know my fixed costs are 500. As for my variable costs, we already figured out just when I was parsing the information in the question that my average variable costs are 5. So my total variable costs are that average times the total quantity. So we can think about this as BA times average variable costs, right, where BA is my total quantity. So that thing is just going to be 5 BA, because we knew our average variable costs were 5. To make it easier for me to find this result later, easier for the grader to find that result, just going to throw it in a box. Okay? Now in a question like this, I did a little bit of extra work here, extra steps to show how I was getting to this. If you're confident in your ability to come straight to that equation, right, you can go ahead and write that down. The problem with going straight to that equation, however, is that if you made a dumb little mistake, like you misread, this 5 here for costs as 50, with 50 BA, when I'm grading it, I don't know where that mistake happened, right? So if you got to this line in the middle, you've done all the economics here. You should get close to full credit, even if you accidentally write down the wrong number for one of these things, right? But if I just see a wrong equation there, that could be wrong for all kinds of reasons. It could be wrong because of a slight misreading of a number. It could also be wrong because you were fundamentally doing it in the wrong way. And so that's going to lead to more points being taken off. So I might have saved a tiny bit of time if I hadn't written out these first 2 lines here. But by writing those out, I'm basically giving myself some insurance, right, against those small mistakes, helping make certain that if I do make those small mistakes, I get plenty of partial credit for that question. All right, let's move on to part B now. Write down a function for Ansel's profits, pi BA. So I'm going to go ahead and immediately say that's what I want to find here, right? Profits as a function of BA. If he chooses to order BA books, you can assume the other bookstores will continue to sell 200 books. All right, so I want to make a note of that over here. So I'm going to think of this as, I'm going to write those other bookstores as 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm just going to know that the sum of those is going to be 200. All right, so Not part of my answer here, but just that seems like useful information here. Okay? So what are Ansell's profits going to be? Right? Well, it's going to be his revenues minus his costs. So I could think of that as revenues of BA minus costs of BA. I've done a bad job writing here because my little note just butts up against my equation. To help myself out, I'm going to make certain that I know those are two separate things. All right, so what are those revenues? Those revenues are going to be the price that Ansel can get for his books, which depends on the total number of books being sold. So it's going to be what he sells plus my 200 books from these other guys. All right, and then he gets that price on each of the BA books he sells, so that's my revenue. And then I've got my cost function, which I wrote above, but I'm just going to try to keep things come back so I can move quickly, so I'll substitute for that a little bit later. All right, that little bit later is pretty much now. So I want my answer purely in terms of BA. So this price function, this cost function can't stay there. I've got to kind of expand those out in terms of BA. So let's start with that price one. Okay, we're going to go up top to our demand equation here. Right? And so that was 50 minus 1 over 10. And that 1 over 10 is multiplied by the total quantity. So that total quantity is BA plus 200. All right? All of that is now multiplied by BA. And my cost function, I found it above. And that was 500 plus 5BA. All right. Couple of things to point out about what I'm doing here before I move on. A couple of things that help me keep my answer straight. Notice I put square brackets around when I was plugging in for price here. Okay. The reason I did that is that I knew when I was plugging in that price function there were going to be some other things in parentheses there. So the square brackets help me kind of keep things clear. Instead of having multiple parentheses where I might mistake kind of when I'm distributing things out, which terms I should distribute, this helps make it obvious that this BA plus 200 should be multiplied by that 1 over 10 before anything else happens, right? I also put my costs in parentheses here. The reason for that is that helps me keep signs straight, right? If I had just written down 500 plus 5B, I'd be wrong because this minus sign is going to turn that 5B negative, right? So I want to use these parentheses initially and then work through all the sign flips and changes, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. And rather than try to simplify everything all at once, if I go in baby steps, I'm less likely to make mistakes. So my first baby step here is going to be this thing in brackets. Let's distribute the 1 over 10 and the minus in front of it to those other two parts. So I'm going to have minus 1 over 10 BA minus 1 over 10 times 200, which is just going to be 20. All of that is still times BA. All of that is still minus 500 plus 5BA. Okay? So I can simplify this a little bit by combining the 20 and the 50. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So now I've got 30 minus 1 over 10 BA. All of that times BA. And while I'm over here, I might as well start distributing out that minus sign. So I'm going to make it a minus 500, right, and a minus 5BA. Okay? Be really careful that you flip that sign to negative when you get rid of those parentheses. Okay? It's sort of a standard way for people to go off is getting those signs wrong. All right, we're almost there. I can expand this out, and I want to expand this out because I'm going to have a 30 BA that I can combine with that 5 BA. If you leave the answer like this, you'll get full credit for part B. However, we're probably going to need to use this function in the next part, and so making it as simplified as possible is going to make our lives easier for the rest of the problem. Okay, but if you're ever uncertain about simplifying, you can just go ahead and leave it like that. At this point, this is purely a function of B's. There's no other functions embedded there. There's no prices, there's no costs, nothing like that. So this would be correct, just not as useful as it could be. So let's go ahead and make it useful. So it's going to be 30 BA minus 1 over 10 BA squared minus 500 minus 5 BA. So the last thing I want to do here is combine those two BA terms. That's going to give me 25 BA minus 1 over 10 BA squared minus 500, right? That is going to be my profits from any chosen level of BA. So that is my final answer for part B. All right, so what do we now need to do in part C? Find the profit maximizing number of books for Ansel to order and calculate his profits at that number of books. All right, so we know we want to maximize profits. So let's go ahead and start setting up part C here. Right? I'm trying to maximize the profits from choosing BA, and what I get to maximize over is that choice of BA. Now, we've seen a lot of different profit maximizations over the semester, so this might be one of these scenarios where you're saying, oh no, I don't know what formula to use, I don't know what approach to take. We did things with, what's the best level of output to produce, right, given market price. We did price equal to marginal cost in some cases. We also saw things like what's the best level of input. So what you need to do is think about what the moving parts are in this problem, right? The only thing that this store gets to do is choose that value of BA, right? And we know now from part B exactly what the profits from that are. So I'm not thinking about marginal costs or anything. I'm not thinking about input prices, right? I'm not thinking about marginal products. All I'm thinking about is BA affects this function. And so what I want to do is just maximize that function with respect to BA. And the way I'm going to do that is take a derivative of profits with respect to what I got to choose, with respect to BA. And where that derivative equals 0 should be my profit maximizing level of BA. Okay? So we've got to go back and keep track of our profit function we found in the prior part. So that's right there. So now I'm going to go and run through and take that derivative. So first term gives me 25. Second term, I'm going to bring down my exponent. It's going to be 2 over 10. Lower my exponent by 1, just leaves me with BA. My third term gives me 0. Bad looking 0. And all that's equal to 0. Okay? So now we're just solving for BA. Okay? So if I move that 2 over 10 BA to the other side, and I'm actually going to write it as 1 over 5 BA, just simplifying that 2 over 10. We're just about there. I just need to multiply by 5. And so that's going to give me that BA is equal to 125. All right. So now we need the profits that he makes at that level of output. Okay. So here's where I'm going to go and just plug 125 back into my profit function. So that's going to be 25 times 125 minus 1 over 10 times 25 squared minus 500. All right. So now we've got a decision to make. I've got this equation. It's all in terms of numbers. And obviously, I could calculate this and get it down to a single number. All right. However, right, that looks kind of messy to me. It looks really annoying to do because, if nothing else, I've got 25 squared. So perfectly reasonable decision to make this point is call it quits, put a box around that. That's a correct answer, right? Because it's only numbers in here. So that's sufficient. Another perfectly good response is plug into your calculator and get a number. Okay? Still show me this line in case you mess up plugging into your calculator, right? I don't want you to plug in and, without showing this, you accidentally hit the wrong number, you get a totally wrong number for profits, and I have no idea where that wrong number came from. I can't give you as much partial credit as I'd like if I don't know how you got there, right? So showing this shows me how you got there, right? And then you could go ahead and plug it. The other thing you can do if you're really comfortable with your algebra is see if there's a quick way to make your life a bit easier here. So if I looked at this, I might say, you know what? I can actually pull a 25 out of everything here. Right? And that's going to give me 125 minus 1 over 10 times 25, right? Minus, so this is 50 times 10, which is 2 times 10 times 25, so that's 20 times 25. So that's just a 20. All right, so this thing here is now going to be 125 minus 20, so that's 105, minus, what is that, 2.5, and so that's 102.5 times 25. Didn't make my life a whole lot easier. So I would actually say, not going to bother with that. Let's box this sucker and call it a day, right? But if this was a number I needed to plug in down the road, I would want to go ahead and calculate it. But there's nothing we need to plug profits into, right? If we go back to the previous part, we do need to plug BA in down the road, so we do want a single number there. I wouldn't want to leave that as, 25 times 5 up here. I would actually want to get it down to as simple a form as possible so I can use it later, right? But this is sufficient for profits here. All right, so now we switch over to part D. Can you say whether the outcome you found in C is the quantity of books Ansel will sell in equilibrium? If so, explain why it is Ansel's equilibrium quantity. If not, explain what additional information we need to find his equilibrium quantity. Okay, so here we have to think about what equilibrium means in this context. So in this particular context, we are thinking about stores competing on quantity, right? That's the choice they get to make. So an equilibrium is no store wants to change the quantity it's providing given what everybody else is doing, okay? So in other words, this is going to be Ansel's equilibrium quantity if he's going to stay put no matter what else is going on out there. I know this probably isn't going to be the equilibrium because our other stores haven't adapted yet to what Ansel just did, right? So Ansel entered this market, and what we found is he's going to sell 125 books. So if we think about these 4 stores before that were selling 200 books, well, now overall quantity is 325. That's going to drive price way down, okay? These stores decide to sell 200 when the price was, if we look back at this demand equation here, 50 minus 200 over 10, so when the price was 30. Now the price of those books is way lower, right? And so they're going to change how much they want to provide. Their last unit was no longer worth providing because before their revenue just covered their costs on it. Now, if the revenues are lower, it won't cover the costs, right? So that means we're not in equilibrium. That also means to know equilibrium, I need to know how those other firms are going to adjust, okay? So how am I going to write this out here? I'm going to write it out by basically succinctly stating those things, okay? So we're not in equilibrium, right? Because when Ansel adds 125 books, market price will drop. Other firms will want to sell less at this lower price. Lower quantity for other firms changes Ansel's profit maximizing level of B. We can't know how this changes without knowing the other firm's cost functions. To know how their quantities will adjust. All right, so once again, this sort of written explanation takes a lot more time than the other parts, right? At least if you know how to set up those other parts. And so if you're comfortable getting through those other parts and you still feel pressed for time, it's these written explanations where you can pick up some time by being more succinct, by figuring out how to write more directly, more clearly there. Okay? This is actually a spot where my solutions online are not a great guide because they're overly verbose. I'm trying to tell you every last thing about this. So think about boiling those down to the really critical pieces of information. What exact bits do you have to tell me to fully but succinctly answer the question, right? All right, well, that's part D. And let's hop back and finish this off by looking at part E here, all right? So part E says, a sixth bookstore opens up. How would you expect this to change Ansell's profit maximizing number of books? Be certain to fully justify your answer. All right, here's a case where we could talk through all that logic again, and I could write something about as long as this using the same kind of explanation, right? But we actually have a way to do this a little bit kind of quicker, right? In the sense that we already know how the number of books sold by other firms worked into Ansell's profit function and what we found for his optimal number of books, right? So if I go back here, okay, where that other number of books came in was this 200 right here, okay? So if I follow that down, that was this 200 over here, right? It was this minus 20 over here. And so it made this constant out front a bit smaller, right? Which ultimately became my coefficient on BA in my profit function, okay? So if we had a larger number than 200, my coefficient in front of BA is smaller here, and that's going to lead, if we think about our profit maximizing function here, right? That's this number 25 in there, right here. If I make that smaller, BA gets smaller, right? So I can say that in just 2 or 3 sentences, okay? So I want to say that in 2 or 3 sentences, right? I'm going to go, here's my answer to part B, right? Sixth store will lead to a greater quantity sold by other firms, right? Increasing that quantity leads to a lower BA star for Ansell, right? Given his best response function found in part C. And just to be like super clear, I know what's going on here, I'm going to say that the 25 in that function would be smaller. All right? So noting that, and it took just a couple seconds to write that out, noting that it's the 25 that gets smaller tells the person grading it that you didn't just randomly guess that it affects the best response function. You're pointing to me exactly which term in there is affected by this. And if you can point to that term, I know what you're talking about, right? And your answer makes sense to me. So that's a little bit quicker than writing out like that really long explanation of everything in part D. Okay? All right, so that is the end of that question.